Sometimes you just gotta believe.
Hi, welcome to Storytime with Carrot. I'm Carrot. Today we'll be experiencing Chapter 3 of a story called A Wasted Future, written and narrated by me. If you haven't seen Chapters 1 and 2, I recommend checking them out first. Otherwise, this one might not make much sense. I'll leave links in the description. Now, let's see what this chapter has in store for Carrot 2. Waking up in a clean bed was glorious, and I started the day feeling like the queen of the world. I guess technically, based on lineage, I pretty much was, but that needed to remain a secret until after I dealt with the king of bandits. I made my way to the dining room and ordered a couple of fried eggs. As I munched them down, enjoying their savory flavor, I watched the people in the room. All of them ordinary people doing ordinary things, none of them knowing who I really was. After I ate, I had a chat with the owner of the inn and said about the various tasks she assigned me to pay my debt. By 2 o'clock, I was free to inquire about the winged, and I struck up a conversation with the barkeep. I learned that the town itself didn't have any of the winged in their employ, but they frequently traveled through on their routes. I just needed to bide my time. I spent 4 days working for room and board, with no sign of the winged, and I was beginning to feel restless. I knew I would encounter one of them eventually, but I also knew that time could be subjective in the wastes, and the word frequent didn't necessarily mean often. I was stewing on that matter over a cup of hot tea when I heard the sound I hadn't even known I was listening for until that moment. One of the winged had finally landed. I watched the door intently, trying to contain my excitement. It wouldn't be very queenly to appear starstruck over someone I may one day hire for the Empire, but I was indeed excited. If I could convince this wing to deliver the letter I'd written to my uncle without giving away my identity, that would be ideal. However, the wing didn't do favors for strangers without some kind of bribe, and the calluses on my hands were proof enough that I had little more than my skills to offer. When the door opened, the plan I had fine-tuned over the last few days crumbled to pieces. I knew this winged better than I knew anyone else in the world. The winged were trained to scan a room in an instant, and I could tell the precise moment he saw me. My heart skipped a beat as excitement flashed in his keen eyes, but he headed toward the bar without so much as a nod. I went to my room as quickly as I could without drawing attention and sat on the edge of the narrow bed to think. He had known to keep quiet, and that meant I was in a lot more trouble than I thought. I decided to leave that night. I would send payment for the room later, but I knew by the way Jarek had turned away that the bounty on my head was being extended to more than just the Bandit King's henchmen, and that meant it had to be a big one. I stayed in my room all day and into the night, until the sounds of the town stilled to a soft murmur. After tossing my bag out the window, I led Hope out through the front door. I'd let anyone who saw me assume I was taking her for a midnight walk, until I didn't return. I grabbed my bag and ambled toward the dock. The fastest way out of here, without wings, was definitely by boat. As luck would have it, no one on the docks paid any attention to me walking my dog, and likewise, no one noticed as I slipped silently away into the starlit sea. I hadn't gotten far when I heard a whoosh above my head and a piece of paper fluttered into my lap. Scrawled hastily across the page were 4 words: "Meet me, 3 days," and a series of numbers. I was immediately thankful for my childhood obsession of the winged that had led me to learn how to decipher their number codes. I knew exactly which way to go, so I pointed my boat east and paddled my way to my dreams. As the sun rose on the second day, a city appeared in the distance. If my calculations were correct, the meeting place was either inside that city or just on the other side of it. I decided I wouldn't dawdle, but I did want to see what was on the ground floor of a couple of those buildings. I scavenged around for a bit, found a few useful things, and by sunset I had picked my way across the city. There, at the very edge of the city, poking out of the side of a hill, was a place Jarek had picked. It was a tiny chapel, remarkably intact, with none of its stained glass windows broken. Its bell tower stood tall and proud, and I could see the faintest glimmer of gold from a bell that still hung below the high spired roof. Although the entrance was a bit buried, it was obvious that people used this place regularly. I wasn't sure how this could possibly be the safest place for a secret meeting, but I trusted Jarek. So glancing around me, alert for prying eyes, I ducked inside. The interior was comfortably warm against the chill of the falling night, and the little man at the front of the room smiled in a way that suggested he'd been expecting me. "He's already waiting in his office," he said. "Please follow me quietly." He led me through a door at the base of the bell tower and down a spiral staircase to a narrow passage that widened momentarily but then almost immediately narrowed into another steep staircase going up. At the top of the stairs was a dark passageway that turned abruptly into a very short corridor lit by a soul torch that seemed too bright. The old man led me through a narrow doorway before my eyes had fully adjusted and told me to watch my steps seconds too late as I stumbled unceremoniously into a knee-deep puddle. My eyes adjusted and I cringed. We were in the sewer of the city I'd just walked through. I followed the old man, staying close to the walls, trying to avoid the slimy water that slithered down the center of the sewer floor. After dozens of turns, some of which I was certain had led us in complete circles more than once, we stood before a heavy wooden door. The old man knocked 3 times with the hilt of his dagger, then turned the knob. We stepped down into a narrow chamber with books and papers piled everywhere. Maps of the wastes covered the walls and table surfaces, and Jarek sat in a chair behind a desk that had clearly been down there for far too long. "Carrot, I'm glad you were able to find the place," he said, as though he'd simply invited me for coffee at a new cafe. "Oh yeah, no problem at all. Didn't even have to stop for directions," I said, playing into his joke. The old man grunted his disapproval at our frivolous behavior and left the room with a huff. Jarek and I immediately started laughing. After an embarrassingly long time, I managed to regain control of myself. The pressure of life on the run could get to anyone. Sometimes it came out in laughter, but more often it came out in tears. I was thankful that this time it had been laughter. Once Jarek had assured me that he was in control of the city above us, I felt safe enough to allow myself a chance to relax and spent the rest of the night catching up with my best friend. By sunrise, I had learned that ever since I'd escaped the Bandit King's henchmen in the swamp, there had been a hefty bounty on my head. The Winged were doing everything in their power to keep the information from spreading too quickly, but when magic had been freed, the portals to alternate dimensions had been reopened, and the Winged were pretty sure the King of Bandits was also the new King of the Nether. I learned that a couple years ago, several of the Winged had formed an elite squad under the command of General Whitethorn. The elites were a good way into planning how they'd conquer the King of Bandits when they learned exactly where his hideout was in the Nether Dimension. General Whitethorn had planned a meeting with the Bandit King by tricking him into thinking he could arrange an alliance with the Winged. However, the general had gone into the Nether 2 weeks ago, and no one had seen or heard from his party since. Jarek, being second in command, ended up in charge of the whole operation. I'd also learned that immediately upon seeing me at the inn that day, Jarek had sent his fastest messenger to tell my uncle that I was still alive. When my stomach growled loudly enough to wake the dead, Jarek led me back into the sewer to another heavy wooden door next to his office. On the other side of the door was another long, narrow room. Jarek led the way to a counter at the back of the room, behind which a short, stocky woman in an apron wielded a ladle as deftly as an artist with a paintbrush. She filled 2 bowls to the very brim without spilling a single drop of the steaming, foul-smelling slop and slid them across the counter with a twinkle in her eye. Jarek took both bowls and led me to a table across the room. "Helda loves feeding new people," he said, as he set a bowl of stinky slop in front of me. I eyed the slop in the bowl and silently questioned the motives of someone who found joy in serving such unappetizing sludge to a guest. I was hungry, though, and I'd eaten far worse during my time in the swamp, so I lifted the bowl to my lips and took a sip of the most heavenly golden carrot soup I had ever tasted. Jarek laughed at the look of surprise on my face. "That's her magic," he said. "If you can get past the way it looks and smells at first, you get to experience a flavor uniquely tuned to being superbly delicious to you specifically." "So yours tastes different?" I asked. "To me it does," he responded, sipping his slop slowly, clearly savoring it. "Wow," I breathed and gulped down the remainder of the delicious slop, barely stopping myself from licking the bowl. Seconds later, another bowl of foul-smelling slop appeared in front of me. I nodded to Helda and reminded myself that I was a queen as I resisted the urge to slurp down the entire bowl as hastily as I had the previous one. With a belly full of delicious slop and eyelids heavy from days of travel and little rest, I followed Jarek out into the sewer to yet another narrow room behind a wooden door. "Guest quarters. Take your pick. You're the only visitor we have," Jarek said. "I'll show you the bathing rooms after you get some sleep." I curled up on the bed behind the nearest door, and with Hope sitting guard, I fell asleep, thinking about the irony of bathing rooms in a sewer. This story is getting good. Were you expecting the old man to lead Carrot 2 into the sewer? What a weird place for an outpost. I can't wait to see what happens next. If you liked it, be sure to give that like button a little tap. And if you don't want to miss chapter 4, I suggest making sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Love ya. Bye.
Sometimes you just gotta believe.